All right, welcome to another episode of the Scripting Dan podcast. As usual, I'm Fernando, and today I'll be sharing 3 different non-coding skills that should or will actually set you apart as a developer. I know, sounds weird, but as developers, everyone gets technical. So one good way to stand out from the crowd is to focus on the non-technical skills and to develop those. Your manager will definitely love you for that, I promise you. So the first one is time management and prioritization. These are 2 tasks that can make you shine both when working remotely or in the office. Either way, having the ability to correctly manage your time without having your manager actually micromanage every step of the way, every day that you're in the office working is definitely a plus. And how can you do this? So one of the things is understanding priorities for your project requires you to care about your task, essentially. What I'm trying to say here is that for you to shine, essentially, you need to care about the project's well-being, just like your lead or your manager do. If you look at the overall state of pending work and listen to other people's updates during the daily meetings and so on, you can start gathering details about missing deadlines, emerging problems, and even unexpected changes of requirements. Consider these 3 extremes, if you will. So you can work exclusively on your own tasks, right? Just focus on them and forget about the rest. This implies that any emerging tasks like scope creep and getting new requirements will be ignored by you. You and essentially your teammates having any problems will have to find someone else to solve them. You will not help them. If you do this, by the end of your sprint or whatever work iteration you have, your work will be done, your tasks will be closed, but the entire project could be on fire and you're just showing that you don't really care about that. Granted, you might be thinking, I'm doing my part, but you're exclusively doing your part. And as we're gonna touch in a minute, that might not be ideal. You can also focus on helping, exclusively focus on helping your teammates, essentially. But this may cause you to, be delayed on your own tasks. Potentially even not being able to deliver them on time, closing your tasks by the end of the sprint, as I previously mentioned. You're extremely helpful up to the point where maybe even some teammates start to depend on you constantly. This might feel great at one point, but because you're becoming the go-to person on your team, which is in some situations a great place to be. However, you're becoming the bottleneck for everything, essentially. If people has to go through you or has to ask you questions or ask for your help on everything they do, what are they going to do the minute you're not there? Either because you're sick or because you're taking vacations. Being the only go-to person, being that much needed within your team is never a good thing. It might feel great for you, but it's not ideal. And from a team organization point of view, your managers might not like that either. Again, because then everything depends on a single person, and what happens when that person is not available. And finally, the other extreme will be constantly jumping between emerging tasks, essentially. Just forgetting about your current task, forgetting about what has been assigned to you for the current work iteration, and just helping solve any emerging problem that might happen. Again, from the helpful perspective, that's great. You're helping everyone, you're solving problems, you're just making sure nothing grows to the point that becomes a fire in your project, but you're just ignoring your tasks. Essentially, it's kind of like the previous point. There are usually 1 or 2 developers who know the system that you're working on end to end, to the point that they can spend their entire time working on these emerging tasks. But they in consequence have very little time to work on any anything else, any big feature essentially. So as I mentioned before, none of these extremes is great, neither for you as a developer or in the eyes of your manager, if you will. So the ideal place where you want to go, where you want to be, is kind of around the middle. Obviously, always having and finding the best balance between all these three extremes is not possible. You're not a machine, but you have to keep that in mind. You have to remember where you are, what's around you, what's happening with the project, and try to lend hand whenever it makes sense. Always prioritize the work that has to be done within the current work iteration, and try to be helpful, but not to the point where you become the bottleneck. If there is knowledge that you share, that you have, that others are constantly seeking, then try to share it. Try to write it down, create a common wiki, a common documentation place where others can find that knowledge without you. That will show your manager or your team actually that you actually care about the project, that you actually care about the team itself, and not really about you and how you feel being needed by everyone. So that's kind of the first advice. Now, the second non-coding skill that I think is very relevant, it's been relevant for years now, but it's becoming more and more relevant as remote work becomes the norm in many companies, is to understand how to work with remote teammates and teams, essentially. This might be obvious to you if you've been in both situations. If you've been having to go to the office for years, and now suddenly for a few years you've been working with remote teams, you might have noticed the difference. But there is a difference. If you're new, and if you're having to maybe go to the office a few days a week and then be remote the rest of the week, you might not see it at first, but there is a difference on how you treat your teammates or how you communicate with them when you're remote. And I think it's really important and relevant to understand that difference. Some tips I can give you are, whenever you're having a conversation with someone, a video call, essentially, make sure you put on make sure you open the camera. Now, I know this might be awkward to some people, especially if you're new to within the team, or if you're not that social. It might be difficult for you to start showing your face to your teams. But consider that when you're having a remote conversation with someone only through audio, you're losing the body language part, which it's a huge percentage of how humans communicate. So you're already limiting your capacity to communicate, and your capacity to understand, or their capacity to understand the message that you're trying to relay. When you're communicating with someone face to face, there is a lot more that goes between the lines than the actual words that you speak, and that has to happen when we're remote as well. And the only way to achieve this is through opening your camera and through showing your face and your expressions as well. Just make sure that you show yourself, not show an image or a virtual avatar, which is also something that can be done and might transmit some of that of those expressions, of that body language, but it's just not the same. Just try to be yourself. It might feel awkward at first, but you'll eventually bridge the gap and it will become second nature. Just keep doing it and think about the others on the other side of the call. They also need to understand what you're trying to say. Now, when it comes to written communication with remote work, with remote colleagues, there are essentially two ways of doing this. You're either having a long form, essentially, an asynchronous conversation with someone. These are usually emails. And why am I touching on this? A lot of people can think of emails as a text message alternative to chat, essentially. Or in other words, it's easy to think you can use the same communication standards in both. But it's not true. This is not true. Email requires a bit more attention to detail because the person reading it has no way of reading between the lines, essentially. You're sending a big chunk of text, usually through email. And again, you're no longer seeing the face or the body language of the other person. You have to interpret. You're not even hearing their tone whenever they are speaking the words. So it's very easy to misinterpret a poorly written email. Just think about the following example. Hey, Sean, what's up? Can you send me the report I asked for last week? So it's just 2 lines, just asking what's up and then asking for a report that I asked for last week. But the way I wrote it, maybe you're not hearing it because I'm reading it as I intended it. Let's put it that way. I'm simply asking for a favor because I asked for this last week. However, Sean can read it. Can you send me that report I asked for last week? And that change in intonation is something that I can't control. I can't really tell how Sean will read my email. And that second interpretation, it's kind of, making more emphasis in the fact that I asked for something since last week and I haven't received it yet. So instead of, just keeping an email short and sweet and potentially being misinterpreted, I could have said something like, did you have a chance to finish that report we talked about last week? So see how I changed a few words. Now I'm asking if they had a chance to do it because I'm assuming they also have other things to work on. And I'm not saying that I asked for something and I'm not getting it. I'm now suddenly changing it into, we talked about this last week. So it was a conversation between Sean and me. And it's not something I asked for. It's something that, we discussed and that he had to do. Now, it's a very silly example, but by me spending 5 minutes on this simple email, I removed the possibility of him misinterpreting my email. So this is something that when you're writing an email, when you're sending a lot of information, long text at least, you have to consider that because you're not able to quickly respond to potential misunderstanding if the other person doesn't read your message as you intended it, because you're not there anymore. Now, when you're talking about short form, immediately answer conversations, when we're talking about chat. Now, this is different because we are there, even though we're not showing body language, even though we're not transmitting the tone of our voice, we are there to fix whatever, problem in our message was the second before. So I like to think about this type of communication, this type of conversation essentially, as the remote version of turning around and saying something to your colleague, sitting next to you. However, instead of, before with the email, I try to say, don't try to make it short. Instead, try to make it clear. Now, I'm trying to say, this is a chat conversation. So if you were to be in the same room with this person, you wouldn't turn around and you wouldn't spend 10 minutes explaining what you need from this colleague. You would just try to be as concise as possible and get to the point so that you're not wasting their time, because this is, they're giving you their full attention at the moment where you say, hey, Kate, can you do this for me? So if you're writing a chat message, keep those same standards as well. Try to be as concise as possible, but try to also remember that they might be working on something else. And since this is not a live conversation, this is not an in-person conversation, they might take a minute to respond, to get back to you. So again, something like, hey, Kate, I sent you over an email. Please take a look at it when you have a minute. It's not the same as, hey, Kate, just send you an email. Let me know what you think right now because I need your opinion. It's not the same. And Kate might be working on something. Kate might be they might need a couple of minutes before getting back to you. You have to remember that. You have to accommodate for that in your conversation. Your teammates, again, your teammate might be busy doing something else. So take that into consideration. Remote communication in the end with developers can sometimes be a problem, since the IT industry in general doesn't require you to be very social, at least not at an entry level. So this is why developing communication skills, even in remote environments, can set you apart from the rest. And finally, the other tip I wanted to cover is related to the previous one, but specifically about video calls. So I call it video call etiquette, essentially. Again, being on video calls is becoming more and more common, and making sure that you understand the minimum standards that you have to cover whenever you are being part of a remote call with other people is crucial for you to be considered like a good teammate and a good communicator, which is, again, something really useful and very relevant when you're in part of a remote team. So the first tip within this will be to make sure that you're on time. Personally, I like to think that you're on time if you're 5 minutes early, but that might be just me. The point here is that when the meeting starts, you need to be there, either 5 minutes, 3 minutes, or just right on time. But if you're arriving 2, 3, 5 minutes after the minute started, then you're either wasting everyone's time or just missing information that might have been useful for you. So just make sure that you're on time. That's just considered with everyone. The other thing is to remember to mute yourself when you're not speaking. This sounds like a basic thing, but you would be surprised the amount of time I heard someone having a conversation with a teammate or with their wives, whenever they're home joining the call, because they forgot to mute themselves whenever they weren't speaking. Even if you're not speaking, even if you're paying attention, things like your phone ringing or your dog barking in the background, they might just be distracting or even interrupt the speaker at the time. So just remember, just mute yourself, and by default, and just unmute yourself whenever you're actually going to speak. Now, again, this I already covered this, but make sure you enable the camera whenever it makes sense. There are situations in which they don't make sense, like in a huge group where everyone's just listening to a speaker. If you're not going to interact with the speaker or with the teammates, then sure, don't enable the camera. It probably doesn't make sense unless the speaker wants to see everyone's faces. But if you're going to be part of the video call, if you're going to interact with everyone in there, then having your camera on will show everyone else you're present in the moment. And it will also help with your communication skills, because it will also transmit your body language, as I already mentioned. And finally, just don't interrupt the speaker. Even if you're actually having something relevant to say, maybe they're wrong, you want to interrupt them and correct them. Maybe you have relevant information that you want to add on top of what they're saying. It's a lot easier to just raise your hand when you're in person and get seen, so you can actually contribute to the conversation that way. But usually video call software like Zoom and others, they allow you to somehow get the attention of the speaker. Maybe some of them have your raise your hand feature, which just click and the other person will see that you're actually raising your hand and you want to have the mic for a second. And if there are no features like this, just try to use the chat feature. Try to maybe raise your hand, physically, and enable your video camera so that people can see you. The point here is just don't be rude, don't interrupt whoever is speaking, and make sure that you only speak whenever they give you the place to do it. That way everyone gets to listen to each other. Really understanding how to behave in a video meeting is just as important as behaving correctly in a physical one. And you have to remember that. Just because this is a remote meeting, a video call, it doesn't mean it's less important. It doesn't mean it's less relevant. So showing proper etiquette means you respect the time and the presence of everyone else involved. Just, the minimum thing that you can do. And that's it for today. That's it for this episode. Those were 3 non-coding skills to set you apart as a developer. So remember, learn, how to manage your time and the priorities that you're given. Learn to be flexible in that space that you're moving, but try to be centered and try to never forget about your own tasks as well. Understand how to work with remote teams and teammates. Remember that just because they're remote, it doesn't mean they're not there, or it doesn't mean that they are there for you all the time. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind that there might be time zone differences where communication means having to be asynchronous, and that's it. And finally, whenever you're joining a video call, just remember the basic etiquette for the video call, for that meeting, and remember that you have to respect everyone's time and presence there, because this is just as relevant as a physical meeting. And that's it. I hope that you found something interesting in this episode, and if you haven't yet, subscribe. Remember that you can find these episodes everywhere where podcast episodes can be found, and on YouTube you can also find the Scripting Then channel, where you can subscribe and get the video versions of these episodes, especially relevant if you want to see my face and my guest's face on the interview episodes. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you on the next one. And that was it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget to rate the podcast in your favorite podcasting app so that it can reach more developers. In the meantime, if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, or X as people call it, just look for me at DeleteMan123. And that's it. Thank you, and catch you on the next one.